podcast number 2. This is on the French Revolution. This is going to be more of a summary of the French Revolution rather than an in-depth report. Otherwise, we'll be here for like a half hour. We'd like to keep these podcasts to just about 10 minutes. But what's really going to be important for us to understand is the cause and effects. The things in between don't show up as much on the Regents exam, so we're going to spend a lot less time on them. And like I said, a lot more on learning the basics of things like the French Revolution's causes and effects. The French Revolution can be remembered by the word meals, and we're going to break that down right now as we go through it. The M is for money, and money was a true problem within France because the economy was bad at the time. There was increased taxes, particularly only on the Third Estate because they were the only ones who paid the taxes. The king's debt had increased because King Louis XIV and XVI continued to expand upon the Palace of Versailles. The price of bread had increased because of poor harvest, meaning that people again and again had to deal with inflated prices of bread. And you can see how the percentage of your income goes up and the percentage that is actually spent on bread based on this graph. It used to be half your money was spent on bread. Now we're looking at 80% of someone's money a year later going into this supply. And it's a tremendous, tremendous difference. There's a lot less money to go around. People become intolerable of the kind of lifestyle that the king's living when they're struggling to get by on a day-to-day basis. The E stands for the Enlightenment ideas of the time period. And they're new ideas about the government that form. People like Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire talked about natural rights, rights that couldn't be taken away from you. Things like life, liberty, and property. And they wanted more change. So these ideas, these people, they wanted democracy. And they pushed for it, and they were hated people by the French nobility because they spread these ideas to the everyday person about what it was going to be like when this democracy came around, when there was separation in government, when there was 3 branches of government like Montesquieu had laid out, and there was a check on the power of someone like the king. The A, the American Revolution, gave a great deal of hope in order for the French, because they said if a bunch of farmers from America, a bunch of yeoman farmers for that matter, were able to win, and they don't even have an organized military, then how could we not possibly win? We can defeat a king. They defeated King George. We can defeat King Louis. And it proved that if the government is not doing its job, then the people should overthrow it. That was the basic overall premise of this thing. 2. The L's. Louis XVI is going to, when he comes to power, he spent way too much money. And we talk about Louis as it's like a avalanche that's coming down upon him. There's nothing he could really do to stop it. But his court was made to impress Europe, but became a symbol of waste and corruption. There was no way of him hiding from people outside of Versailles who were only miles away in Paris of the truly, truly stunning nature of the Palace of Versailles. But what it represented was, how could you possibly allow anyone to get away with this much? He overtaxed the people. He married a foreigner, Marie Antoinette, that they didn't like. And he was just unpopular with the total population. The S stands for social structure, of course. And we talk about the old regime, the old way. It had 3 estates. And all French people belonged to one of the 3 estates. And this will really be broken down. Estates determines the people's legal rights, their status, where they were in society. It's another one of our social structures that was very rigid, and you were born into where you were, and there wasn't much fluidity between them, just like the caste system, just like the encomienda system, just like feudalism. So it sometimes gets compared to those on the regions. The first estate was made up of the clergy, which had 1% of the total population, 10% of the land, yet they paid no taxes. They actually got money paid to them. Their tithe, their 10% tax that went to them on a yearly basis. The nobility, on the other hand, had 2% of the population, had 25% of the land, and they got paid taxes. They didn't pay any either. Okay, and they had certain privileges that they could have during this time. And the nobility received high positions in church, government, and the army. And guess this, that's only, and the 97% of the rest of the population made up the rest of what we saw. The bourgeoisie, or the middle class citizenry, was huge, but they were overtaxed. They were underappreciated for what they did. and they lived with 97% of the total population and only 65% of the land, paying all the taxes that there were. And this included heavy burdens upon city and peasants as well. They had absolutely no say in government whatsoever. Family determined which you member you were a state of, and you could not change your estate. So there was, like I said, no fluidity whatsoever in this system. You can look at the data from 1789. You can clearly see how much land people owned and basically as percent of the total population. And it was very offset. It was skewed in the numbers. You have huge amounts of land going to a very small percentage of the total population. And that's where we often get Dickens' tale. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Because for those in the first and second class, it truly was the best of times. For those in the third estate, it truly was the worst of times. Now we're going to get going on the effects of the French Revolution. We're going to skip right over the events and go directly to the effects. We had said that the French Revolution was a cycle, like a pendulum, and that we would begin and end in the same exact place. And we did. We start with the rule of Louis XIV and come back in the end to the rule of another absolute monarch after the fall of Napoleon, who was in himself an absolute monarch. But for us, even though we didn't cover things such as the Reign of Terror and so on and so forth, things in France do change, and they do change around the world as a result. First and foremost, the biggest effect is the middle class, the bourgeoisie rose in power. So your doctors, your lawyers, and they had more political say, they had more social say in society, and they were going to see the fruits of this, in not only in their wealth, but their rise to power politically. There was this increased nationalism in France that happened during this time. And this included people, you saw the tricolor flag that was constantly being waved, parades, proudness of the wars that they had won, even though Napoleon had been beaten in Russia. So there was a great deal of pride within the nation. France established democratic institutions during this time. The Estates General had to meet. It wasn't like when Louis had went 150 years without calling the Estates General. The Estates General had to meet during this time, and it was a big step in the right direction for France as far as the revolution went. Those ideas that were talked about by Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, having the separation of powers, they went into effect, and people saw change. Even though we end up in the same exact place with the monarchy, it's a monarchy with far less power than before. There's elections, constitutions. And the biggest thing is it's going to inspire nationalist movements in other nations. Remember, we talk about, I say nationalism, you say unification. The unification movements in Italy and Germany come about as a result of this, because people said, wow, look at how these people rallied together and really came together during this time. And it also inspires independence movements in Latin America with people like Hidalgo and San Martin and Bolivar that are going to rule over their people during this time. Okay, but the last effect, and this is going to set the stage for World War I, is the Congress of Vienna. Remember, we say that people came to the French Revolution hungry for meals, and they left waving with their palm. And the purpose of the Congress of Vienna, it was to turn back the clocks on Europe to the way things used to be. Okay, to turn back things to the way they were before the French Revolution. The A was alliances, to make sure that no one would ever become as powerful as Napoleon did and take over Europe. So the thought was, if we had alliances, which we know is now foolish because it's one of the causes of World War I, that would be a great way to make sure that no one gained too much power. The L was legitimacy. Get back the legitimate leaders of this of Europe, these monarchs. And M was money. They wanted reparations, money to take it into account for the damages that Napoleon had caused during the war. And we can see the Congress of Vienna, the main guy that we need to see is Austria-Hungary right around here, and a guy named Metternich who's really going to run this meeting and really push to turn back the clocks on Europe. And that's what we get. The host at Vienna is Prince Metternich himself, the Castlereagh of Great Britain, King Frederick Wilhelm III of Prussia, and Tsar Alexander I of Russia, along with Charles Maurice de Talleyrand of France. The key principles: balance of power. No nation would ever become too powerful, they said. And this is what we talked about causing World War I, because now everybody gets pulled into the war. Legitimacy, restore the absolute monarchs to the throne of Europe. Compensation, money to nations that fought France. And coalition forces would occupy France for 3 to 5 years. This is going to lead to the downfall of Europe and the beginning of World War I.